Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 309 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm your host, Danièle Cybulskie. The 14th century is one of the wildest times in European history, which is exactly why I've always loved it so much. Famine, war, plague, you name it, this century's got it. 50 years ago, Barbara Tuchman wrote a beautiful book about the 14th century, which is still an enjoyable read. But we've learned a lot since the 70s, so maybe it's time to take another look. Enter my next guest. This week, I spoke with Helen Carr about England in the 14th century. Helen is a postgraduate researcher at Queen Mary University and the author of The Red Prince, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, as well as What is History Now?, which she co-edited with Susanna Lipscomb. In addition to writing for various publications and appearing on History Hit and other podcasts and specials, Helen mentors writers on all things medieval and narrative history. Her new book is Sceptred Isle, A New History of the 14th Century. Our conversation on how England fared in these wild times, why we need to take a fresh look at the past, and what her take is on some famous Plantagenets is coming up right after this. Well, welcome back, Helen. I've just realized it's been 4 years since we talked, so it's great to talk to you. We've already been talking for like half an hour, so it's time to get to work.
We had a lot to catch up on, didn't we?
For sure. Okay, so time to get to work. You just wrote a wonderful book called Sceptred Isle, and it's about, the subtitle is A New History of the 14th Century. So I need to ask, what made you think we needed a new history of the 14th century?
I know. I think it's a bit of a sort of weird title, and it's often one that people pick up on and say, well, what's new about it? But the fact is, when we're writing history, it's always new. It's new because it's a new perspective. This is my perspective of the 14th century. There is new research in there that hasn't been done, but it's mostly a collection of events and stories and characters that I have found fascinating about this particular period put into this narrative history of the century. And even though there have been lots of academic work on the 14th century, there's been lots of volumes of essays about the 14th century, the only real popular history about the 14th century was Barbara Tuchman's Distant Mirror, which was written a long time ago and actually only started in 1340. And it was also focusing on England and France, whereas this book, Sceptred Isle, is focusing on England, even though there's talk of the relationship with France in it. So it's a new history, really, in a sense that this is my version of the 14th century, and I'm sure there will be more in the future.
I mean, there should be more. This is the best century. And so it's great that there is a new history because, as you're saying, Barbara Tuchman wrote that like 50 years ago. So it's time for a new one. So you really kept that tight focus on England. What was the reasoning for that? Because like these are all connected. You have to make decisions about this. What was it that made you decide to keep that tight focus on England?
Sure. Well, it was already a massive project in itself. You know, you're talking about a period of nearly 100 years, and a lot happens just in England in that time. And if I was sort of casting my net wider, rather than making these sort of references to Europe or France or Spain and trying to include those stories as well, it would have been too big. It would have been too big a project for me. It would have been too big for the reader. And it also would have just been so surface level. And what I love about being a historian is digging down into the record, into the archives, trying to recover lost voices, trying to really get into the detail around certain events or certain circumstances or characters. And so there are tough decisions when you're writing a book. And when off the podcast just now, we were talking about those difficult decisions as to where do you stop, where do you start, where do you focus? And I think when you are covering such an extensive period, I think the focus needs to hone in a bit more.
Yes. I was looking at the 14th century. I'm teaching a course on it right now, and there is so much information. You have to figure out, where am I going to start? Where am I going to stop? Especially with this century where so much is happening. So sort of along those lines, you've divided this into 5 parts, I think. What made you decide you're going to divide them into 5 parts? Because so much is happening. What was your thinking along that?
That's a really good question. It was a while ago that I did that. So I'm trying to remind, what was my thinking? Well, I think just purely stylistically, I think that it's really nice to read history books like that to sort of create those dividing moments. And for me, that came often with a change of kingship, but it also came with a change of theme. So there was, for example, when the Black Death hit in 1348, for me, that was a real catalyst for major change going into the second part of the 14th century. And even though the monarch didn't change in 1348, the feel of the realm, the human experience, what it was to live in this period dramatically changed. So I felt like that deserved a section that had been separate to the previous one, which was all about how Edward III had gone to war in France and won lots of battles, and wasn't he wonderful in chivalry? And, it's a very different take on the period. So it felt like a natural point to create that divide.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so while we're on kingship, we're going to get into more individual kings in a moment. One of the things that you've gone with that might get people talking is you talk about Richard II, who's at the end of this period, being the last Plantagenet. Whoa, you threw down. What's this about?
I know, I'm being cancelled. That's really interesting because no one else has really asked me about that. I think people just either just assume that I'm right or they just haven't really focused on it. So yeah, in my mind, I consider Richard to be the last Plantagenet because Richard is the last monarch who goes through that unbroken line. So his father was not the king, but he was the Black Prince who was the heir. So it's not the first deposition in this period. I mean, we see that with Edward II, but it's his son that inherits the crown. So it is kind of still carrying on through this line. And what you see in 1399 is the first Lancastrian king. And so for me, that is the time where the sort of age of the Plantagenets ends, even though Henry, of course, has Plantagenet blood. But he then starts his new dynasty with the House of Lancaster, really, as monarchs rather than magnates. So that's why, for me, it felt like a natural conclusion.
Yeah, it's interesting that more people haven't gone there. And I think that probably has to do with wanting to connect a great king like Henry V with a great king like Edward III. I think people want to make sure that these guys get included in the title of Plantagenet, even though,
sure,
as you're saying, it's not father to son anymore.
Yeah, I mean, even their name Plantagenet was a later creation. So, it wasn't like Edward III was going, well, I'm a Plantagenet, because he wasn't. He wasn't saying that at all. That happened later in the 15th century. So I suppose it helps for narrative purposes as well to be able to create those connections. But I think there's so many different arguments to be had, and it's all full of nuances. And I'm sure there's lots of papers and academic journals about it.
If there aren't, there will be, right? We'll be able to find some. So where did you decide to start? You start New Year's Day, 1300. Where do you start this book?
So I start the book in 1307 with the death of Edward I. And it felt like a natural point to start the book because Edward I, kind of to be honest, deserved a book in his own right. He was such a formidable king. There was a lot about his reign that really shaped the fabric of how we consider the British Isles today. But I thought starting with his death is kind of starting with the end of something, because it's also in 1307 when Edward dies, it's a very dramatic death. He's in the middle of something else. He's in the middle of this war with Scotland, which Edward II is supposed to take up the mantle for and to go into battle and win big victories like his father had done. It also starts in the middle of when things were looking pretty prosperous. England was a realm that was generally quite wealthy. Edward had successfully conquered Wales in the century before. It was the rise of the universities. There was a population increase. Things were looking good. And as soon as Edward inherits the crown, it almost immediately starts to go very wrong.
Mm-hmm. How much of this can we lay at Edward II's feet? So tell us what happens during Edward II's reign. It's not all his fault, but there's some pretty big things that are his fault.
Well, I think when I was writing this, I wanted to take more of an interest in characters rather than looking at these figures as kings and what they did or didn't do right, and trying to understand the psychologies of them and why they would make the decisions they make. And I think Edward II is fascinating because he is a perfect example of somebody who just didn't have the skills that the role of kingship required. He lacked confidence. He wasn't a natural military leader. And you do have people who fail to inspire admiration from their contemporaries. And even though Edward was revered as a king, I think people struggled to warm to him as a monarch and feel like they want to be ruled by him. It felt like he was always needing to be ruled by them. And so there was a real clash of personalities. And Edward's greatest error was the fact that he could not rule independently. And instead of doing this, I suppose, on a more diplomatic way, which would be, having a council that he relied on heavily with a group of noblemen, which is how they would have wanted it to be, he instead always seemed to gravitate towards a favourite, and his most famous favourite being Piers Gaveston. And I think this is because he needed that sort of fraternal support. He needed somebody to say to him, this is the right decision. You're good enough. I'm supporting you. I'm behind you. He needed that affirmation of the very fabric of who he was. And the problem with that is you're elevating somebody of comparatively low status to a status at his level. He was allowing Gaveston to effectively act as regent when he wasn't around. He was allowing Gaveston to wear have a dress code that was not really relative to his station. He gave him the earldom of Cornwall, which was something that was usually reserved for members of the royal family or had royal blood pulsing through their veins, and he had none of those things. And so it was sort of a how-to guide to irk the nobility in his relationship with Gaveston in that first 15 years of his kingship.
Well, I think that you're getting at something really important that maybe we don't see very much in discussions about Edward II, that he needed this bromance, he needed that affirmation, and he needed it from a man, because he could have gotten it from his wife. In fact, most kings leaned on their wives for this sort of affirmation, validation, all of those sort of emotional things. But Edward needed this from a man. I think that has a lot to do with culture, perhaps, even more than his perhaps attraction to Piers Gaveston or later Hugh Despencer.
I think that too. And I also think that it was because his father was a bully. I think Edward I was a formidable man. He was terrifying. And I think, can you imagine being the only surviving heir to a man like that? He was very hard on him. And, you only have to look at people today who have had that sort of experience growing up. He didn't share that with brothers. He had two much younger brothers when his father remarried, but he didn't have anybody to lean on in that respect. He had close relationships with his sisters, but he was quite starved of that sort of male affection and male love, which to think that people did not need that in the Middle Ages is just incorrect. Everybody's needed it always.
Yes. And I think that a lot of people maybe are too hard on Edward. He was terrible in a lot of ways, but if we take him as a person, which is what you're trying to do in this book, we do need to give him a little bit of grace, I think, human to human.
I think also that what's so interesting about Edward is Gaveston sort of brought out the best in him. He was very kind and generous when he was in a relationship, we can call it, with Piers Gaveston. You only really see this change in Edward with his second favourite, and that's Hugh Despencer the Younger, who was awful. He was an awful individual. Like, if we think of baddest people in history, Hugh Despencer will be right up there. He was a very grabbing, avaricious, cruel individual. And what he had, though, was the ear of the king, and it was really only after his time spent and this close proximity and close relationship with Hugh Despencer that you see a shift in Edward's character to becoming paranoid, much more aggressive and much more punitive as well, and just making feckless decisions.
I think that's right, in that the tone of the relationship is very, very different. And of course, this is when things start to move. So I just mentioned Isabella. What happens with Edward? What happens with Isabella?
I know, she's such an amazing character. So Isabella and Edward, which is not what everybody would think, they always thought they always hated each other. They didn't at all. They had a very good relationship. Again, up until Edward became particularly close to Hugh Despencer the Younger, and Hugh Despencer the Younger became more powerful. What was unfortunate was that around 1325, Edward started to fall out with the King of France, who is Isabella's brother. And this prompted, probably incited by Hugh Despenser, a bit of a personal vendetta against Isabella, simply for being French, because her brother was an aggressor against Edward, and it was all over Gascony, as the rest of the 100 Years' War was, pretty much. But it's certainly in the 14th century. But Isabella then went to France on a diplomatic mission in 1326 to try and smooth all of this over. And what happened was Edward neglected to realise that in France she had allies, she had support, and she also reconnected with Roger Mortimer, who had fled England. He had managed to escape from the Tower of London after the Battle of Boroughbridge. And what was even worse for Edward and more stupid was that he allowed his son to go over to France to pay homage for Gascony, therefore giving him into the hands of his mother, the heir to the throne this is. And as soon as Isabella has her son and the future King of England in her possession, she has everything in her arsenal. All she needs is an army, which was something she found reasonably simple to come by. And so she invaded England. But it's important to note this was not to overthrow Edward. It was to overthrow Hugh Despenser the Younger, because overthrowing the king was treasonous. So they had to pin it that they were overthrowing Hugh Despenser, who was already really unpopular. Nobody really liked him. He was just popular with the king, which is what kept him alive. So when Despenser was disposed of and Edward was there effectively under house arrest, Isabella and Roger Mortimer installed the new young king, Edward. Edward II relinquished his crown to his son. But what the issue was you still had a king who was alive, and then you had a new king. And as long as Edward II is alive, Isabella and Mortimer are not safe. So at some point, I believe Roger Mortimer gave an order to have Edward murdered. And that's what I believe that happened. He knew that there had already been multiple attempts to rescue him from house arrest. He'd been moved from Kenilworth to Berkeley Castle. And I think it was in Berkeley Castle he was murdered.
Well, I mean, speaking of relationships, you mentioned that Isabella is pretty powerful. She's pretty independent. Then she gets involved with Roger Mortimer, and then things go south. Tell us about this relationship, because this is one that you spent a bit of time on in the book.
Yeah, so I find this fascinating. And I refer to this period. I use the motif, the Wheel of Fortune in this period, because it really is a particular political time where somebody is at the top of the wheel. They're doing really well politically. The idea is it's a medieval motif. You've seen a lot of manuscript culture in the 14th century. And the idea goes that you have the goddess Fortuna who spins the wheel, and whoever is at the top of the wheel gets spun off the top and they're crushed by the spokes at the bottom. And that's something that you see repeatedly. I mean, look at Hugh Despenser. He's right at the top of the wheel, gaining loads of land and wealth. And then in comes Isabella and off he goes from the top of the wheel. And then Isabella and Mortimer are at the top of the Wheel of Fortune. But with their success comes greed and their own avarice. You know, they don't act in a dissimilar fashion, really, to how Hugh Despenser did. And what they try to do is continuously control the young king. And their control and their grip over him becomes tighter and tighter and tighter. The older he gets and the more paranoid they become, their regime is going to be overthrown, which, spoiler alert, it is. And they tumble from this Wheel of Fortune into, well, certainly in Roger Mortimer's case, to the scaffold. So you really see this change in circumstance. But it's interesting because that is a theme that follows, and you see it with Edward as well. It's with that power and that desire for power, particularly if you are not king, there is paranoia and cruelty that comes with trying to maintain that position. And we talked about Edward II's greatest faults. I think what made him a failure as a king, and his greatest fault, was destabilizing the very structure of monarchy in the early part of the 14th century, where you had a king at the top and you had the nobility, and the king was always revered. By pulling people up to rule effectively alongside him who were not meant to be there, he completely destabilized that structure. And in doing so, allowed this age of really sort of quite literal political backstabbing to take place.
Yes, I think you're right about that. So we were talking about the Wheel of Fortune. Eventually, Isabella and Mortimer are thrown from the top of the wheel, and Edward III comes to the throne. What's your take on him? Because when we talk about Edward III, I think you're one of the people who's like, was he that great? Was he the best?
I know.
Tell us what you think about Edward III.
I know. I'm being cancelled again because I don't like Edward III. No, I do like Edward III. I think he was fun. I think there's a lot to like about Edward III. But what my problem with how Edward III has been treated with a lot of writing and historical writing is that he has been so revered, over-revered, I think. And I don't think that he has faced enough criticism by historians as to how much of a warmonger he was and how much damage he did to the very fabric of French society. And I know it could be argued, okay, but is that not just part of war? Well, yes, it's part of war, but equally, this is a country that he claimed to be king of, and he's not treating who his people would be with any level of respect or fairness. I think it was cruel. And the armies that he led through France and the damage that they did, this idea that, chivalry can be applied. We're so chivalrous because we take prisoners. No, you don't, to the poorer members of society. These people were treated as fodder, and they were killed. And there's many accounts of the most awful incidents where townspeople were murdered. And I think that there's so much focus has been put on Edward as this very Victorian hero. There's this sort of lingering Victorian sort of reappraisal of Edward still exists. And I think that I am just being critical of that particular idea of who he was as a character, because what he achieved, yes, he managed to obtain a lot more land for England, but at what cost? I think that was my point about Edward as a war leader, as a warrior and as a warrior king. He created this incredibly masculine cult around Arthur and St. George and chivalry, and he established the Order of the Garter. And what he was very good at was creating a unity with his nobility, which resulted in the same thing that happened with his father not happening with him. And he, in that sense, made England a strong realm. But I do believe that his ego was a real problem in his kingship. And this idea of considering Edward and the Black Prince as a hero and something to aspire to, I have a problem with that.
Well, I think that's a fair assessment. So how much do you think this had to do with culture, and how much do you think this had to do with personality? Because it's something that you had to think about it hard if you're going to push back against this Victorian ideal, right? So what do you think? You've mentioned that this might be his ego. Do you think this comes direct from culture with this everyone's drinking the Kool-Aid about Arthur, or you think that this was like a personality type thing?
I think it's a combination of two things. I think that the culture was incredibly powerful. And I think that if you study the court of Edward III, it was a pretty hedonistic, fun place to be. There's no secret that he was really trying to reignite this cult around King Arthur. Before the Order of the Garter was established, he founded an earlier order called the Order of the Round Table, which was all based on these Arthurianisms. He wanted to rule in Arthur's image, like as per the ideal model of kingship in the Middle Ages was to rule in the image of this mythical king. But I also think it is about character. I think that all of these kings had very individual characters, and I think that they always brought their character to their kingship. I mean, Edward, I think, got a lot from his mother in relation to his love of dressing up and pageantry and spending money. There was a contemporary poem written about Edward called Winner or Waster, and it talked about how actually he was being too frivolous and he was spending money too readily. And really, we always criticize Richard as a king, but he spent that early part of his reign, so much energy was spent mopping up the issues that had been the hangover of Edward III's fun years fighting in France, which actually ended up costing the country a fortune. It was in the end, it was the people who were having to pay for that.
Yes. Well, we've spent a fair amount of time with Richard over the course of the last year on this podcast. So I'm going to leave Richard to the side for a second and ask you more questions about your research in this book. In that, you've worked in the 14th century before, you've worked with Joan of Gaunt. Who are some of the people that you really enjoyed sort of coming back to again or looking at again?
Yeah. When I encountered this, I got to the point where when I started to feel like I was covering material again, for example, having to do 1381 again. And I initially came to it thinking, I've got to do it again. How am I going to make this more interesting? But actually, I found it so much more interesting. The people of 1381, there was a brilliant project led by one of my old supervisors, actually, Adrian Bell. So he was one of my old supervisors when I did my medieval history masters, and he has worked on this brilliant project called The People of 1381, and that was an extensive project into understanding who the rebels were. And so I used a lot of that. I went back to the original records that Adrian had uncovered, and whilst this was all being digitized, and I looked at the people and the characters who were part of that rebellion, reconsidering who they were as people, as their motivations, women as well as men, where they came from. And I really enjoyed that aspect of it. So I suppose that was an event that I enjoyed coming back to more than I thought I would. The people that I enjoyed returning to, I think I enjoyed researching the characters that I'd never really looked into more than I enjoyed the characters I came back to. I did enjoy looking at Richard in more depth because I didn't with John of Gaunt, because the focus was on him. Mm-hmm. So that was interesting to the time when I wrote about Gaunt being in Spain, for example. I was able for this book to focus on what Richard was doing in England and thinking about the culture of his reign, the emergence of the Renaissance and how he responded to that was interesting to me, and to thinking about Richard as a patron was very interesting to me. But yeah, I think I would say in relation to the characters, I think it was the characters that I started to work on more in the earlier part of the century that I found, I would say, the most academically rewarding in what I was researching with them.
Well, one of the characters that you pulled out that hasn't gotten all that much love and you really gave a lot of love to here is Joan, who is the princess who died because of the plague. Why did you want to put a lens on Joan here?
I loved talking about Joan, writing and researching about Joan. And what happened to Joan was it was a real point of determination in my focus for the book. So nobody really knows what happened to Joan. And I find that quite extraordinary. And I thought, well, who's looked at this? And it turns out that it's not been really looked at in a huge amount of detail. There have been some published works on Joan. She was part of a book on the Plantagenet princesses, the lives of the princesses, written a very long time ago. And that assessment of what happened to Joan, I have found to be incorrect. And my approach was to go back to the archive, to go back to all of the original material, using any of the more up-to-date scholarly research around this time, around her, around the Black Death, to try and understand what happened. And I think I've probably come to what I think is the most reasonable conclusion as to when she died and where. It took a while. I spent a bit of time in the archives working through it, but it made for probably one of my favorite parts of the book. And I was just incredibly touched by following what happened to her, and then also just being able to see how, through the record, how much her family grieved her, because that's not something you see very much, particularly when we're dealing with medieval records. You don't have letters and diaries. You don't have that. You have to look at these incredibly governmental, more rigid documents. But there is one instance in the calendars, the calendar of close rolls, where Edward writes to Alfonso of Castile to say that his daughter Joan, who was traveling to Castile to be married to Alfonso's son when she died, was not going to arrive. And he talks about how I'm understanding that to be himself and Philippa, his queen, were touched by the sting of grief, the bitter sting of grief. And he uses those words. And what I found so affecting by that as well is that anyone who has lost somebody they love, anybody who's gone through grief, it is bitter and it stings. And for me, it just felt like one of those amazing temporal moments as a historian when you really sort of feel like you're touching the fingertips of somebody who lived 700 years ago.
Yes, absolutely. And this brings me to my last question for you, which is your life has changed a lot since you started this book. And you put this in the book. You let us know, give us windows into this. So how did that change how you looked at this century? You're doing a new history. You're bringing yourself into it. What do you think that brings to the work?
I think there is nowadays a real, it might be a commercial trend, or it might be necessity, and it's not something I judge at all, for kind of writing books really quickly and pumping out books, and you've got to finish it in 6 months, you've got to finish it in a year, and all of these sort of 30 under 30 lists. And it just drives me mad because one of the things that is so wonderful about being a historian is that you get better with age. And your life experience can, in some ways, not inform how you look at the record, but you have more time and space to sit with the material that you're engaging with. And it's something that you shouldn't rush. And I think that life happens around writing books, and you go through all of these undulations yourself, be it life, be it death, be it hardships, be it incredibly positive moments. And I think what is wonderful is that the record doesn't change, but you come back to it every time a slightly different person. And that's why I think I really am trying to counter this idea, particularly for young historians now, working now, that you have to do everything now, because you don't. And it takes time. And that time is a wonderful gift when you are writing history, and it will only make you better. That's what I would say about that. So how it informed my writing, I think that's just entirely subconscious.
Well, I think that is a lovely way to end this, because I think you're absolutely right. We just get better with age and what we can bring to this as humans, because as you're saying, the portraits that you're creating of these characters, they become richer the more you understand about yourself and life and all of these things. So I hope that people...
And your own experiences matter in this. Like, I had a baby just before I wrote this, and one of the women I encountered in this book was Elizabeth de Burgh. And, you know, I could not believe that nobody had picked up on the fact that she had a baby with a husband who had died. 6 weeks later, after giving birth, she married Roger Damery, and she would have been expected to go to bed with him that night. Mm-hmm. And anyone who has had a baby, that's mind-blowing to me. That is on any level. And this isn't just applying my feelings living in the modern day to the past. That is just objectively and biologically a trauma for a woman.
Yes. Well, I mean, this is why we need new histories to come out, right? Because we need these different perspectives. We need people to bring themselves to history. And I think that is something that you have really illustrated for us, both in the book and today. So thank you so much, Helen. So great to see you again, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you so much, Danièle. Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure.
To find out more about Helen's work, you can visit her website at helenhcarr.com. Her new book is Sceptred Isle, a new history of the 14th century. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's up, Peter?
Hey, I've got some Canadian content for you.
What is it?
There was a sharp-eyed shopper in a thrift store in British Columbia, and they spotted some rings and a couple of medallions that had kind of this historical look to them. And they bought them for $30, donated them to Simon Fraser University, and it is very likely these are medieval in origin.
Yes, a friend sent me that because, you know, Canadians, we all know each other, right? So a friend told me all about this. And I think it's pretty amazing that somebody found these and recognized their worth in the charity shop. First of all, I mean, great that people are donating stuff to charity, and also great that people are taking medieval objects and donating them to museums as well.
Yeah, so it's going to take a few more months to kind of figure out what they are. But if you want to take a look at them, we've got some pretty high quality photos on the website. Maybe you can lend a hand out there.
Awesome.
So we've got that. Plus, I found some new medieval riddles to share with everybody.
All right. Have you got a sample for us?
Yeah, this is from a 14th century Czech monk, and he went by name Claret, and he has like 120 riddles, all sorts of fun stuff. The one I like the best is, what did the whole world hear?
What did the whole world hear? Okay.
The horse when it farted in Noah's Ark.
I don't think I get it, but okay. But it sounds funny.
It does. It's pretty good. Yeah, think about it. It makes sense. I think it makes sense. So we put up 20 of them as a quiz that you can take. So go out and prove your medieval chops, listeners.
There you go. Everyone run out and see if you can solve these Czech riddles.
Indeed, indeed. So we have that plus a piece by David Bachrach about the latest book he wrote. It's called Warfare in the Global Middle Ages. And it's a kind of personal piece because he wrote this with his father, the late, great Bernie Bachrach. And this was the final book that they worked on together.
That must have been such a meaningful project, I imagine.
Indeed, indeed it was. So he talks about the behind the scenes and how that whole book developed.
Nice. So he's shared his personal journey on the website?
Yeah, he's got his personal journey, and the book is coming out this week.
Perfect. Well, thanks, Peter, for stopping by and telling us what's on the website.
Thanks.
Okay, maybe I was thinking just a little too hard about Peter's riddle, because I actually do get it. But one thing I never have to think hard about is just how grateful I am to all of you for being here each week, supporting independent history, and yours truly. Whether you're sharing your favorite episodes, letting the ads play through, or becoming patrons on Patreon, you are very appreciated because it's all the little things that you do that makes this work possible. To find out more or to become a patron, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from scepters to specters, follow medievalist.net on Instagram at medievalistnet or Blue Sky at medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulskie, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores. Our music is by Christian Overton. Thanks for listening, and have yourself a wonderful day.